Okay, great. All right, thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming. So yeah, I can definitely talk to you about my adventures so far in this kind of space, this commercialization, translational space, entrepreneurial space, specifically in my clinical area, which is that of pediatric medicine, and as well as hematology. So like Leanne said, I wear a couple of hats here. I'm both BME faculty, my lab's right up the hill here in the Marcus Nanotech building, but I'm also a clinician. So I see kids with cancer and blood disorders. And what I will do in the first couple minutes is talk to you about a couple of entrepreneurial pursuits that I've been part of, and I'll tell it to you in the sense as if everything worked out completely perfectly and swimmingly, and there were no issues at all. Right? And we know that's very realistic, right? Right. So, okay, the very first thing that I was involved with. So this is about probably about 15 years ago when we first started thinking about this idea. So I was still in graduate school at the time, and I was a brand new pediatrician, and I was teaching a class that my PI taught. So I was a TA, much like many of you will be. I was helping teach an optics class. And back then, there was this new thing called mobile phones, these cell phones that just been developed. And we posed to this undergraduate class of bioengineering students, undergrads, similar to what a lot of you guys were and are recently, at UC Berkeley. And we said to them, can you guys make a microscope with off-the-shelf parts out of these new things called cell phones? And long story short, it worked. They could. And we even got huge donations of cell phones from this giant company that was going to take over the world called Nokia, which, again, some things don't work out according to plan, right? And what we ended up focusing on was ear infections. And this was really inspired by my older son, who at the time was a baby and was having tons and tons and tons of ear infections. And I would look in the kid's ear because I just take out my otoscope, ear scope, and I would look at my kid's ear. And when it looked like it was an ear infection, I would go prescribe antibiotics, and my wife or I would go to CVS, Walgreens, get it. And then one day, this is about maybe the 6th time he had these ear infections, and he had them like once a month, maybe even more frequently than that. She turned to me and she said, so what do families who don't have a pediatrician in the house do when this happens? Because you're just prescribing them. I said, well, they have to go to the ER. And they're like, every time? I'm like, yeah. And she's like, well, usually he gets worse at night, so we have to go to ER at night. I'm like, yeah. And she goes, oh. So then she looked at me, and I think it's the first and only time she's ever said this to me. She says, I'm really glad I'm married to you. But it really posed the problem, right, that we were trying to address with this company. Can we enable parents to diagnose their own kids' ear infections at home? And this was really only made available with the advent of the iPhone, the smartphone. So the timing of it really worked out because, as you guys might recall, these cameras on smartphones were actually not too bad. And even when they came out in around like 2007, 2008, it really worked out pretty well. And here's, and this is even, let's see, can you click those on for me? Thank you, sir. So this is from a phone, I think it was even in 2009. So you see here on your right, on your left is a normal ear, and then maybe click the next one. And then on the right, you see an infected ear. So even back then, the phone technology was sufficient to get us diagnostic quality images. So you can see it's a lot more red. You even see some pus there on the right. And so we formed a company, and it was called CellScope, and we formed it in around 2011. I got VC funded several times around pretty quickly. And we served these parents of kids with chronic ear infections, and they remained to be really our major clientele. The way it would work is parents would get these images, and CellScope would hook them up to a physician remotely who would look at these images, and based on what the images looked like, videos looked like, the doctor would decide whether there was an ear infection, then call in the prescription for the parents if they did think it was an ear infection. So that was all perfect, and everything went on swimmingly, right? So we published papers, we got good funding. However, my mom would say the career highlight for me so far was not my NIH funding or any fancy papers I published, but really the fact that this thing was on TV. Apparently Stephen Colbert as a production team knew that he had a ruptured eardrum, and when Eric Topol, who's a big kind of M-Health physician guru, was invited to go on the Colbert Report, and this is when he was still in character, by the way. He's played that ultra-conservative pundit character. This was a few years ago. The whole thing got on TV, and my mom said, "Oh, wow, okay, it looks like you're actually doing something worthwhile." I said, "Thanks, Mom." Okay, so that's one company that we formed. Another company that is actually homegrown here, born from technology developed in the biomedical engineering department and in collaboration with Children's and Emory, is a capstone project. It's an undergraduate project, and a very talented undergraduate who really took this on, and she's now the CEO of our second company here, and of which basically a drop of blood goes into the system, and based on a chemical reaction, the color changes based purely on the amount of hemoglobin that's in that sample of blood. So it's a way to detect anemia minimally invasively with a drop of blood and very cheaply and quickly. So it works kind of like the way your pool pH test would work. This was FDA cleared a couple of years ago. This is now commercially available. We sell this with a few telemedicine groups and pharmaceutical groups, and now we're going to file for over-the-counter clearance from the FDA, and we hope to be able to do that by the end of the year. Okay, so that's it. That's everything working swimmingly and no problems at all. I'm sure Leanne will ask me about some questions related to the lack of problems we have.
Yes, so knowing that you had no problems at all, what would you think might be problems for other people when they develop pediatric technologies?
That's right. So hypothetically speaking, right? So let's think about pediatric technologies for a sec. I mean, maybe I'll engage the audience a little bit. Some of these are not, rocket science questions. So what do you guys view as an issue when we're talking about developing new technologies for kids? What do you guys think? I mean, some of you probably don't have kids, some of you do, but at least you've all been kids. And hand over there.
Accessibility or ease of use. So like you said, for the parents to be able to use, because how the kids can.
Sure. So a technological thing you have to work out, obviously, is it has to be easy enough for the parent, and obviously you're dealing with kids. So one thing we've really realized when it comes to health that's very specific with pediatrics is when it comes to new technologies, and it works both ways, it's a double-edged sword. When it comes to new health-based technologies, people tend to be a little, they don't really care about it that much when it's for themselves. But when it's about their kids, then they care. It's really interesting. It's an interesting psychology, but it could work both ways, because then they're probably more engaged, probably more willing to use it. But at the same time, if there's any inkling of any negative aspects to it, then they freak out much more than if, if it hurts on me, it's fine. But if it hurts on my kid, hands off. So that's certainly part of it. A technological aspect is one part, but there's probably an even bigger part. Yeah.
The child's inability to describe symptoms?
Sure. So that's part of it, part of the user experience. I mean, so in pediatric medicine, repeat the question. Okay, sure. So the question was the child's capability to communicate the symptoms or problems at hand. That is an inherent problem in pediatric medicine. And in fact, when you talk to physicians, to be medical students, and when they decide whether or not to go into a specific field, many people who are turned away from pediatrics actually have that issue. It's like, no, I don't like talking. I want to talk to my patient, right? If I wanted a patient that couldn't talk to me, I would have gone to become a veterinarian, right? And that is kind of the joke, is that the difference between a pediatrician and a veterinarian is really the insurance copays. So that's an inherent part of pediatric medicine in general. But yeah, it's certainly something you have to think about when you're designing your technology. It's part of the user experience. But there's probably something even bigger. So let me pose a question to you guys. So let's think of all startup companies in general. What's the #1 reason startup companies fail? It's a very simple reason. Was that Professor Solchik?
Financial risk?
Yeah, it's part of it. I mean, I'll just, yeah, good. Financial risk, okay, yeah.
I guess lack of demand for the product.
Yeah, so it's all related. So one thing, so when I teach the undergrads here at CreateX, this is a big resounding question. So we here are all technology developers, right? We're embedded in, okay, the technology must not have worked. It's not that. It's simply you made something that your intended customer didn't want to buy. Simple as that. Financial risk is a big part of it. There wasn't a market for it. And with pediatric technologies, with medical technologies in general, it is not like going to the app store where you buy a game. Okay, let's see what I have on there. Candy Crush, right? Where there's two stakeholders, right? There's me, the user, and there's the app company. The transaction is I pay or watch ads, right, on this game, and with this company. That is it is a two-way street. Medical devices, it is not a two-way street, right? So you have to think of all the stakeholders involved here. So there's the user, right? There's the manufacturer, right? The startup company, and well, sometimes even startup company is not the manufacturer. But what are other stakeholders in this ecosystem we need to think about? Regulatory is one. Another one? Insurance, right? That's a huge key, because in medical technologies, the end user often, not all the time, is actually not the customer, right? So what are some other stakeholders? So let's think of maybe medical devices more generally. Like what about medical devices? Let's think of classic medical devices. So stents, for example, for orthopedic or cardiovascular applications. So what are some other stakeholders that actually have to be involved to make sure that the model is financially viable? What do you guys think? So we mentioned the user, who's either the patient or you say the physician, insurance company. Who else? Who else is part of this ecosystem that you always have to take into account? What was that? FDA, yeah. So we said that FDA regulatory. So obviously the capability to market your product is going to be controlled by the FDA, and what its intended uses for will be controlled by the FDA. But there's even more if you think about who else is involved. So who's actually buying? Was that? Parents are buying, correct, to some extent. Who else is buying? To some extent. So so the doctors was mentioned. So as a doctor, let me tell you how little power I have when it comes to this decision making. So when I'm at the hospital and I see a kid with acute leukemia and I do a biopsy, there's medical devices I'm using. Let's even just think of this needle, this biopsy needle. Did I buy that? Who bought that? The hospital. Who in the hospital buys these things? Do you guys know? So there's this whole field, right? It's the supply chain. They are the people that actually decide which contracts do we buy, and who influences them. Look at that. A little bit jaded opinion here. You know, reps from the company. To some extent, yeah, it's very true. And when I'm at the hospital, I immediately know what a rep looks like. The phenotype is very, very, very apparent. The women all look like models, and the men all look like James Bond, right? And the physicians look like me. I'm like, okay, who stands out here, right? They're very smooth, very charismatic, and they touch a lot. It's kind of freaky. But anyway, but yeah, you can see, right? hear how complex this financial ecosystem is here. You have a user, you have multiple users, the physicians are users, the patients are users, you have finances that go from, okay, a patient has a copay, do they have much of a say in things? Not really. The insurance company is a huge deal. Do they reimburse your product? And then whether or not your hospital actually even stocks that product is going to be dependent by multiple stakeholders, of which the physician has one voice. And honestly, it's actually minority voice. So that was one thing we learned here. I had this bravado when we first created the CellScope company of like, oh, I'm a pediatrician. Yeah, I know exactly what I'm doing. And I even roped in key opinion leaders who all said, this is awesome. This is great. This is going to change the way we practice medicine. And yeah, it turns out that physicians actually at the end of the day didn't have that much power. So we had multiple people. So what we wanted to do at CellScope is actually have this be part of every single healthcare system in the country, right? We wanted, obviously, parents would buy it out of pocket, which is ultimately what the business model ended up being. But we wanted healthcare systems to invest in it. And the pitch was really, if you think of how many emergency room visits we could save, you would be amazing. And sure enough, we talked to the heads of Kaiser Permanente. Has anyone heard of them? Kaiser, huge healthcare organization, right? Both in terms of healthcare delivery and insurance. All the physicians said, yeah, we want this. From the very top, we met with the CEOs of Kaiser. Like, yeah, we want this. CEO said, but can you talk to our supply chain people first? And supply chain people came to the table and they're like, well, all this data is just theoretical. You actually you have no proof that this will save ER visits. Well, no, but look, we published studies, and they're like, these studies do not translate into saved dollars for us. It's all theoretical. We said, yeah, but can't you see? Like, we're accountants. We're not in the business of predicting. So boom. So CellScope, which I should also argue, tell you that the story ended up fine. It got acquired recently by a very large medical device consumer products company. I'm actually, my former CEO doesn't want me to disclose it, but I will say that this company is very big, and this week has been very bad for them. So I'm very glad that this deal happened before this week. So anyway, but anyway, the point here is that it's a very, very complex system, and there's multiple stakeholders when you're dealing with anything related to medical devices. The technology is only part. It's a necessary but insufficient part of a startup company's success.
All right, so.
That was a long question, sorry.
All right, so what are some of the specific things that you ran into that took longer than you thought it might, besides the accountants?
Yeah, well, the accountants are obviously part of the picture, but it really is ultimately when you're a startup company, your whole goal is to find your perfect market, find your perfect customer. And we really did struggle with that because we had it, we thought we had it all figured out from the medical side, because clearly there's a need. So that's another resounding point, is that clinical need and even epidemiology to some extent. Does everyone know what that word means? Kind of, how prevalent your disease is and so forth. So clinical need and epidemiology do not equal market viability. Simple as that. And that was a hard lesson for me to learn, because whenever we would kind of pitch this to potential customers, mostly not so much the investors all bought it, but really as we're trying to grow and get other partners, I would always show these slides of, look, how many ear infections there are in the United States each year, the potential healthcare costs that we could save. And they're like, yeah, well, but that doesn't, you're just showing me numbers of patients here. Really, it doesn't quite translate. So that was one thing. In fact, that experience really allowed me to be informed about my next company relating to our blood test. We don't even want to deal with that. So we want to go to the model where we're like Candy Crush. So our devices with Sanguina, our newer startup, really is focused on home-based products that are so cheap that we don't even care about insurance reimbursement and so forth. So we really do want the simple model that most app companies have.
All right. So One question that people might have is working with the FDA. You kind of think of them as slow, but maybe they're not. Or can you give us any idea about what it's like to work with the FDA?
Yeah, so the FDA is very interesting. So first of all, I don't envy them. They're always at the whim of the local political climate, right? Because they get dinged for not clearing things and approving things, both diagnostics and drugs, timely enough. So they're saying, oh my God, we got all these patients just waiting. Look at these patients with cancer, they're dying. And you guys are sitting on your butts. You bureaucrats are sitting on your butts, just not letting these drugs that are life-saving get to the patients, right? So they get pushed, they get pressure on that side. Then something happens, right, where a patient dies, and due to some adverse effect that maybe was caught by the FDA, maybe it wasn't, and then suddenly they have to go on the other side. The pendulum swings on the other side. It's like, oh my gosh, how could you guys have cleared that? How could you guys approve that? You're killing people. So either way, I feel for them, and they're in a tough spot politically, and where you are on the political spectrum is always dependent on time. So one story related to our second startup. So we did ultimately get FDA clearance. It wasn't too bad. We got it cleared in 2017. It took us about a year. We would have gotten cleared within a month, probably in 2015, if it weren't for one company called Theranos. You guys heard of Theranos? Yeah, okay, maybe I won't need to talk about them. But because of that one company that completely pushed the amount of regulatory detail, I would say, in terms of how they vet a technology just based on that one company. So all of a sudden FDA got pushed into the limelight. Well, why didn't you guys regulate this company? It ended up having an $8 billion valuation that fizzled down to nothing once they figured out the technology wasn't worth anything. And the FDA is, oh, okay, I guess we need to be more detailed, and we need to be more careful about these things. So from all blood-based diagnostics right now, we're gonna spend more time. So we suffered from that, but ultimately it still worked out. So the other thing about the FDA that's very interesting. So the overall strategy with trying to get something cleared in the FDA is the complete opposite of what we as scientists, especially in academia, are used to. And any scientist, to be quite frank, because what we're always used to doing when we discuss and communicate our science is to talk about how unique our science is. How different is it from everyone else's stuff? Because that's really how it's going to be impactful. When you're dealing with the FDA, the mentality is actually completely the opposite. When you're trying to get something approved and cleared, your goal is actually to say, my technology is the exact same damn thing as the technology you just cleared last year. And it's a weird mindset. It's a very weird mindset to be able to get into, because when I dealt with it, I was like, okay, here's what I want to say. And I realized I have to now say the complete opposite of that. So that is one thing to realize. Related to that, I would never, ever, 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 ever go have an FDA conversation without the guidance of a good FDA regulatory consultant. So everyone needs that. You are not good enough to be able to handle what to say in front of the FDA when you have these official meetings. So always get a good regulatory consultant. And sometimes, and there are plenty even in the Atlanta ecosystem here that are worth their money, and they understand what small operations and small startups budgets are like. So they can give you a little bit of guidance and say, hey, with this, I would help you do this. If you have more money, I can be a part of your team.
All right. So what makes pediatric devices something that's exciting in the biomedical engineering field? Is that, I think it's really exciting because that's what I do too, but just to hear from you about what you think there.
I think in pediatrics, you really have the capability when you're talking about technology to change a person's life for a very, very, very long time scale, right? And to really affect that person's life and affect how they actually live the rest of their lives. So if you're even just looking at total number of human years affected, right? From pediatrics, it's a much bigger deal. If you think about novel medical technologies, drugs. So I'm an oncologist as well. A new cancer drug is considered successful if it goes through a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trial, and the cancer patient lives another 2 weeks longer than the placebo arm. I mean, that's kind of a bummer as from a clinician standpoint, right? It's like, oh, okay, yeah, you're improving lives for a patient. It costs this many, bajillion dollars and decades of work of hundreds of people, and you're really only helping them for a couple of weeks. Whereas with a kid, if you are able to fix something, you're able to change their disease, even the trajectory of their disease, that will be the dividends are over a much longer time scale, right? And also from a personal standpoint, like I said before, as a parent, your kids are the most important thing to you, and the capability to help a parent go through that, I think, is really, really exciting. And then you have some diseases that in pediatrics, we are now entering this phase of pediatrics where there were no cures until now. And the capability to change a kid's life from an incurable disease to a curable disease, and with all the necessary technologies that go associated with those therapies. For example, we need new technologies, new tests, new biomarkers, new ways to do things at home, theoretically. Those are all really exciting.
All right, so we have a few minutes left. I'm sure we probably have some people who might have technologies that they're thinking about transitioning. So for all our inventors out there, are there resources available to the inventors to help them bring something to market?
Yeah, there's multiple different things. So even here in our Atlanta-based ecosystem, and most of the people online are from our ecosystem?
No, I think some are in other states too.
Some are in other states too. Okay, so here in Atlanta, at least, there's numerous resources for all of you to access, and actually the rest of Georgia as well. One institute that's been very instrumental is something called the Georgia Research Alliance. So those of you who aren't faculty in this room, who raise your hand if you haven't heard of them. Okay, a couple of you haven't heard of them. So this was actually really, I hail from California. Silicon Valley is where I did my training, and I was actually very astounded that this group exists, where it's funded by the state government, and its whole goal is to help bring academic research ideas into commercially viable inventions, with the goal of helping to improve the economy for the state. So you can tell it's a very kind of non-partisan type of organization. This was great. I actually didn't have anything like this. So when I talked to my colleagues in California, they're actually, oh, we're jealous of that. I'm like, really? Okay, great. But it's a good resource, and they're starting to be more involved even at the student level. So I've had, so the third startup company they'll be born from my lab. My former student, now postdoc, actually, he's faculty now too, was intimately involved with talking to the GRA, just vetting the ideas and say, hey, what do you think about this in terms of market viability? What do you think in terms of funding? So they give money too, and it's actually pretty decent amounts. So there's that resource. Within our own biomedical engineering department here, we're also linked to the Culture Foundation, whose whole goal is to help inventors like yourself really move forward in terms of taking inventions to the next step. We also have something called the Georgia CTSA, which is a large NIH-funded center, of which Georgia Tech, Emory are two of the four partner institutions there. There's a program devoted to innovation, which I coincidentally lead, in which our whole goal is to help investigators who are interested in the innovation pathway to really move their stuff forward. So we offer advice, we offer free regulatory consultation. Actually, we have regulatory consultants kind of on the books, on retainer for us. We give advice on how to write small business grants, and we really help move things kind of from the laboratory towards the towards market.
Great. So I think we're done with the time that we had allotted, the 30 minutes. But for those of you who want to stay on, we can continue this a little bit longer if Dr. Lamb has some time. A little
I
bit.
think so. Yeah. Yeah. I can say a little bit. Yeah.
And also maybe we can take some questions from the audience for him.
Great. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Lamb? Or even if are there any online?
Not yet.
Okay. We'll go back here.
For the types of small grants, whatever you had mentioned, the past 5 minutes, are those these sorts of things where they become vested, or is it kind of a no strings attached grant essentially?
So the grant mechanisms I'm talking about, yeah, they're always funded by the federal government. So I'm really thinking of these things called small business grants, SBIRs, STTRs, funded by different agencies within the federal government, NIH, DOD, NSF. They all have these mechanisms. And the goal of those grants is to give small amounts of money. And, they're not insignificant. They range anywhere from, 6 figures, 5 figures to sometimes 7 figures, depending on different phase. But they're meant for small companies, and there's no strings attached to them, meaning you don't have to give up equity and so forth. You have to write a grant. It's a very special type of writing, I've learned, and our lab has probably gotten about 6 SBIR grants now, and it's a very different type of writing than what you guys as students are used to writing. Even like your NSF grants for graduate school are very different than this type of writing, where you really do have to think about things like market, things about a business plan, a commercialization strategy, and so forth. But yes, the mechanisms I'm talking about are no strings attached. Both the CTSA will help. We have services to help people get these federally funded SBIR grants. The Coulter Foundation gives funding that is no strings attached, at least in terms of equity. And also the GRA gives small amounts of funding, of which there's no strings attached, at least in the first couple of phases. Yeah.
Hello. So my question was about how, so you were talking about all the different people that are involved in the process of like bringing a technology from, the lab to the market. And when we're talking about like insurance companies, for example, like what are some solutions that you see in the foreseeable future to reducing, costs for medical care, especially for children or, or even young adults who or families are left with burdening medical bills because their child just happened to have cancer, happened to have a certain disease. So
Yeah.
Is there like a solution to that, or?
I would say that's one of the biggest nuts to crack in the pediatric space. One thing I didn't mention is that most children who need medical care are poor. Simple as that. So this is part of the ecosystem. So in Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, here I'm pointing to our sign here, 60% of our patients are uninsured. They're on Medicaid. So using them as a potential customer base is going to be hard. Like if you're actually expecting them to cough up money, it's a hard thing to think about. So you have to integrate all these things into your business model. So then you have to talk about, okay, so if we're dealing with Medicaid, that's a type of insurance, as you probably know. Medicaid doesn't give much reimbursement for anything. So when we were dealing with this for our blood test, we looked at how much Medicaid reimbursement was for anemia, and it ended up, when we found out the code, it was about $1 per test, and we're like, okay. So that's when my CEO said, okay, we're going to scratch that business model, right? So there's a lot of things to think about, but this is one of the biggest issues, right? Access to the customer base that actually has the financial resources to make your business case / model sustainable.
So I think we have some questions online, Sherry, if you want to share the first one.
Is there a program to coordinate with Children's Hospital to test our products?
I would say linking up with people like ourselves here within the Pediatric Technology Center is probably the best way to do it. There's no formal one-size-fits-all type of paradigm, but with each technology, we'd certainly be happy to entertain it and talk to inventors about it, and depending on what stage it is, integrate them with a study to be conducted at the Children's Hospital. Right.
Is there additional testing necessary? Do devices have to be specific to pediatric patients, or can they be adults and children?
Depending on, it's a very good question, depending on what you're trying to do. If you want FDA clearance, then FDA would say, okay, what age groups are you testing this on? So it really does depend on what the inventor wants. But yes, if they're trying to get regulatory clearance, then age does matter quite a bit.
What additional considerations does one need to consider when designing a device for a pediatric patient? Example, design inputs, clinical considerations, regulatory considerations.
I think it always depends on technology. It's a great question, but related to medical devices, for example, if something's implantable, one big issue is whether or not the implantable device can tolerate a growing body, because that's what kids do, they grow. So that's one aspect. Another aspect related to diagnostic testing, if there is sampling of biofluids, blood, for example, the volume is going to matter, because if you're causing pain and taking out a lot of blood, the total amount of blood is proportionally different when you're dealing with a small kid, when you're dealing with a baby, a neonate, a preemie. And those are all things that have to be taken into account. So yeah, there is kind of special things to consider when you're dealing with the pediatric technology, but it really is a case-by-case basis.
The last question was asking the best way to contact you via email. I can have them send those.
Oh yeah, you can
my
just
email
Google me.
Okay.
I'm pretty lucky to have a pretty unique name. I didn't think so growing up at the time, but yeah, there's not many guys with my name.
I was struck when you said that the accountants weren't swayed by your academic studies. Is that always the case? I always assume that in order to address marketing, getting someone to try your technology, that publishing would be the best way to go about it.
Yeah,
are there cases?
You'd be surprised, Todd.
Yeah.
I was very surprised. But I think they just come at it from different angles, right? They're accountants, right? They don't read Nature and Science. They don't care. Yeah.
All right. So I think that's probably our last question. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We will have another one of these in October. Hold on, I'm going to give you the date in just a second. And next time is going to be about microneedle patch. Yes, thank you. And what was the date? October 16th at 12. So come and see our next talker, and we're glad you all could join us. Thanks.
Thank you, Ron.